And we continue now. I'm Steve HIGHSMITH. With me is Republican Pat Toomey. A few months ago, not everybody in the hierarchy of the Republican Party was excited about Pat Toomey versus Arlen Specter when they thought Arlen Specter was the candidate. You say you're actually in the mainstream of Pennsylvania. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
All right. When the Democratic registration is 4.3 million, whatever it is, and the Republican registration is 3.1 million, how do you define mainstream?
You know, it's not necessarily defined by party. You know, the fact is, as you know, the state Senate's got a big Republican majority. It's quite likely that in the primary this past May, there were actually more Republicans went out to vote than Democrats did. I think my views of a sort of common sense fiscal conservatism really resonate across party lines. That's why I was elected 3 times in a congressional district where the Democrats outnumber the Republicans. But my opposition to the bailout...
Isn't it true that in that district Republicans won more often than not, though, correct?
My predecessor was a Democrat,
right,
and that district has voted for the Democratic presidential nominee in the last 5 consecutive presidential races.
Pretty close, though. I mean,
it's close,
yeah.
But the numbers actually very similar to the statewide numbers. And, you know, the biggest win I ever had was my last term when people knew me best. But my point is that there's a common sense consensus, I think, in Pennsylvania that we shouldn't be bailing out failing companies. That was wrong policy. I said so under both the Bush administration and the Obama administration. We can't afford massive spending programs when too much borrowing and spending is a big part of what got us into this financial mess. Massive new borrowing spending.
It's hard to prove a negative, though, isn't it? I mean, if Democrats come back to you and say, look, we did all that, much of which was started under the Bush administration, but we did all that, we had to do all that because as bad as things are now, they would be a lot worse. We can't prove to you that it would be a lot worse because it isn't a lot worse. Yeah. And then you're just taking advantage of that.
No, I'm sticking with a consistent principle, and people can just use common sense and ask themselves, does a staggering amount of debt imposed on our kids that we can't afford, huge increases in deficits, is that really good for our economy? Does the government allocating money politically based on politicians' choices, is that better than people getting to make decisions about the money they earn themselves? I'll leave that up to the voters to decide.
Let's talk about Arlen Specter. The Federal Election Commission has ruled in the Club for Growth's favor that it can notify the donors of Arlen Specter that if they contributed to him when he was a Republican and they thought he was a conservative or Republican, they can get their money back.
Right.
Is that dirty pool?
What's dirty pool? Senator Specter is the guy who crisscrossed the Commonwealth, insisting he would never leave the Republican Party, raising money as a Republican and arguing precisely that you should give to me because I will provide that check on otherwise unlimited Democratic control, right? I'm the 41st Republican who will help to sustain a filibuster. Then he took one look at a poll that showed he couldn't be one of the Republicans, and he joined the other side. I mean, if there's dirty pool going on, I think you ought to look right there. So the Club for Growth is simply going to inform people that Specter promised that since he did take their money under false pretenses, he's going to give it back. If they choose to, they can ask to have their contribution returned.
You've been out of, obviously, elected office for a few years now, but nonetheless, people will look at you as being a part of Washington because you were part of a PAC and raised a lot of money. You support a lot of candidates around the country. So if people say to you, well, Pat Toomey, your type of person is a part of the problem. We want to get rid of all this money, and you weren't involved with raising all this money over the years. How do you...
A guy who term limited himself in the House and honored his term limit commitment, then went into the private sector where I did both private business activity, but ran the Club for Growth, an organization dedicated to prosperity, dedicated to the proposition that free enterprise system is the best way to grow an economy. I don't think that's part of the problem. I think, in fact, if our federal government recognize that they can't borrow and spend their way to prosperity, and that our problem isn't that taxes are too low, our problem is that spending is too high. I think if more people realize that in Washington, as they do in Pennsylvania, we'd be in better shape.
All right, I want to ask you a couple more questions along these lines and some others when we get right back. Thank you, Pat Toomey. More with Pat Toomey, candidate for U.S. Senate, in a moment on NBC 10. Stay tuned.
You're watching NBC 10 at Issue.
And back on NBC 10 at Issue with Pat Toomey. Arlen Specter, overall his career, has he been a positive force for Pennsylvania?
Oh, I don't know. I think certainly lately he has not. You know, I think Senator Specter has unfortunately really become a political opportunist. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. I mean, I think he comes down on whatever side of an issue he thinks is in his short-term, near-term political advantage. I mean, he's been on 3 sides of card check. First, he was completely for it. Then when he thought he had a primary against me, he was against it. When he decided he couldn't win the primary and he had to join the Democrats, Now he's back in favor of it again. I don't think that that's principled leadership. I think people who are looking for a U.S. Senator to provide some kind of leadership, to believe in a set of principles, and I think the only principle that our inspector has demonstrated he believes in is his own re-election.
You grew up in a union family.
Yeah.
What makes you think the card check is bad?
I think it's a bad thing to deny workers a secret ballot. I think it's completely impossible to justify an important decision like that and having to make that under the possible threat of coercion. And if you don't have a secret ballot, if people on both sides know how you're voting, then the possibility of coercion is intrinsic in that arrangement, and that's just wrong.
I asked Joe Sestak this question last week, so I'm going to ask you. Do you think the Eagles were right in hiring Mike Vick?
You know, I hope so. I think it could turn out okay. If Michael Vick has an opportunity now to redeem himself, you know, if he, for instance, becomes an outspoken leader in helping animals, you know, SPCA or other organizations that do some great work, he could redeem himself, and then it'll turn out to have been a perfectly okay move. You know, I believe in the ability of people to redeem themselves.
I'll ask you another health care question. If the Democrats in the Senate in particular do one of two things, either the so-called nuclear option where they ram it through, or if they do this reconciliation tactic that's now being buzzed about, where they basically by majority vote, you know, get it done, what do you think that would do to the process or to the potential for dialogue?
It'd be very, very damaging because, you know, the American people don't want a huge overhaul of 1/6 of our economy to be done on a strictly partisan basis. And if they just ram this through, disregarding the clear worries and concerns of a majority of American people, the clear worries and concerns of the Republicans in Congress, if they just disregard all that and jam it through to appease the left wing of their party, I think that will be a big setback for our system.
One of the pillars of the Republican plan is tort reform, and yet the Congressional Budget Office says while it would save doctors a lot of money, the total impact on health care costs would be about half of 1%. Doesn't sound like a lot.
I think most people involved in health care would strongly disagree with that, and what they will cite is the unavoidable fact that a lot of doctors and other health care providers practice defensive medicine, you know, because it's not just the legal bills that manifest themselves. It's the fact that doctors feel like they need to order tests and procedures that aren't really necessary, but if they don't, they might get sued. That adds up to a lot more than 0.5%.
Congressman, thank you very much. Appreciate you taking the time. We hope to see you a lot between now and the election.
Thanks very much for having me, Steve.
Congressman Pat Toomey. That's it for this edition of NBC 10 at Issue. Thanks for joining us. I'm Steve HIGHSMITH, and enjoy your Sunday.